How to change a Lipo battery connector is the topic of today's video, my fellow drifter maniac. And in this video, I'm going to show you step by step exactly how to change over a Lipo battery connector from something like this EC51 to an XT61 like the one fitted to this Power Hobby pack. There is a good reason that I use these XT60 connectors. First of all, a lot of manufacturers like Power Hobby and Gens Ace are swapping to the XT60 system, and that is for good reason. The fact is, I used to have XT90s fitted to nearly all of my cars, but then Armour and Horizon began to change the connectors on the car. The reason why I like the XT60 system so much is these no wires adapters. We can change the XT60 to an XT90 in seconds. We can change it to an EC5 in seconds as well, which will fit the new IC5 system as well. Not only that, you can also get no wires Traxxas connectors for the system and no wires Deems connectors as well, making them very, very useful indeed. Anyway, let me show you exactly how to change a Lipo battery connector over from one of these to one of these. Well, the one thing I would say at the outset is to save yourself some money. When you're changing over any battery connectors, buy them in bulk, because it's virtually as cheap to buy 10 or 20 of these as it is to buy 2 or 3 of them. Also, when it comes to soldering battery connectors, something like these XT90s in particular need a lot of heat. So this is why I use this high-powered Weller iron. A conventional, what I call stick soldering iron, really isn't going to cut it when it comes to changing over battery connectors. Well, some basics before we get started on the lead. If you're using XT60 connectors or even XT90s, remember this little back bit that slides on over the leads before you go soldering the connector on. So make sure you have one of those to hand. Also, I would strongly recommend getting the male and the female half of the connector every time you solder one of these together and push them home like that. The reason for that is when you apply a lot of heat to the back of the connector on here, these pins can shift. If the connectors are put together in the first place, then you can put as much heat as you like on, and the connector will stay parallel within itself. Next up, pay careful attention as to which connector you want to be soldering the wires to. It is very, very easy, particularly if you push the connector together like that. You put it down on the side, or hang on, that's the wrong way around, and we solder the male end on to replace that lead. If you put that down on the side the wrong way up, with some horror you finish and find you've just soldered the male connector onto the battery instead of having a female one on there. Okay, we've got our connector ready to solder. What are we not going to do? Well, we're not going to cut through both of the leads on the battery at once. We are going to cut through them and address them one at a time. Now, with one lead cut through, you're perfectly safe on here. The key thing being is never to cut through both leads at once, because obviously the cutters could actually short the wires out, and this lead remains safely encased in its plastic on there, so it's not going to short out, although this is a metal work surface on here. And a decent pair of wire strippers. We strip off just the amount we need. You don't need a huge bare amount on the end of the wire on there. Now we need to tin this wire before soldering it to that new connector. Absolutely critical part of the job. Never attempt to solder a bare untinned wire to a connector, because you're simply not going to get it to adhere very well. It may stick to start with, but the joint will probably be bad cold, and that could fray away and leave your car dead and buried, or worse, it could short out against something else. So there's 2 ways you can tin wires, and the first one, and my preferred one, if I'm doing a lot of wires, is to use a solder pot like this, but not everyone would want the expense of doing that. So in today's video, I'm going to show you the conventional way that a lot of people will do it, which is to use the soldering iron to tin the bit. Get the wire nice and hot until you can feed the solder into the wire itself. And our wire is now nicely tinned. For safety, you're going to need to do them one at a time. We're going to tin one wire, fasten it to the connector, tin the other wire, fasten it to the connector. And at this point, make sure you've got a sleeve that goes on around the battery connector to put one end of it around your first lead. Double check that you are fitting the female connector to the battery lead. Connect it up in there. Place on our work surface. I'm now going to tin this connector. The flat side is the positive connector, but do double check whatever your connector you are using that you are doing it the right way around, otherwise you could potentially fry the electrics on your car. Now you're going to need to tin the connector the same as you did the wire. Don't want too much solder on there for a reason which I will explain in a minute. That's not the conventional angle I work at, but it's the only way I can do it to film it on camera. You do not want too much solder going in here, because if it drips down onto the other connector, as I found out to my horror one day, you can get the 2 connectors shorting out. If you are not paying attention, you've got one lead on, you get too much solder, drips down as you're fastening the other lead on, and the thing shorts out. If you've just soldered it, you're going to have a fire in very short order. Now again, Not quite the way I do it normally, but I don't want the camera angle on there, so I'm putting heat on the top of the lead until I've got enough heat on there to have melted the solder on the connector. Just checking, and I've got a nice strong connection on there. Now we've got one lead on there, need to take a little bit more care. What you do not want to do is use a metal clamp in any way, say as an example, that touches both of those connecting points at the same time, because obviously when you try and put the negative lead on, it's going to short the whole pack out on there. But I still stand by the fact of keeping the connector together so that when we put heat on this pin, it remains nice and straight within the connector itself. Just need to take a little bit more care on it. In my case, I've got to be very careful that when I cut through the negative wire and I've got the bare end, that it doesn't touch the work surface, because that could easily happen and my positive lead touch onto the work surface on there. Hope that makes sense. Hence the reason why I'm going to use some insulation tape. Just tape that end off so that when I put it into the clamp again, there is no possibility of it shorting out. All being well, he says. So I'm going to put a little bit of insulation tape around this connector, just like that. I am now safe to cut through. Then get negative lead, trim that wire. Once again, just keep it fairly short, the bit you've trimmed off. Now I'm going to tin this wire just like I did the positive one. I'm going to get it hot enough so that the solder is actually melting on the wire as opposed to the iron itself. So now you can see the reason for the tape. Under no circumstances do we want any of this shorting out on here. Now time to tin the remaining negative connector. Do as I say, not necessarily as I do, and make sure you have fitted the remaining wire through the bottom bit of the connector. Now I'm going to tin the negative connector. So without the tape, you have the danger that if you overfill this with solder and it drips down, you can short the connector out. Well, with that connector tinned, time to attach the negative wire. And I can't stress enough at this point, once again, make sure you've got the back bit of the connector on before you solder on your last wire. Not my ideal angle, but it's very tricky to do. And keep it on camera until you can hear that crunching. Solder's melted onto the connector below. Going to leave that to cool for a second. Well, now everything's cooled down, time to remove the tape. And with the tape removed, my connector clicks firmly home into place. And there we have it, one UXT60 connector fitted in my battery. So there we are. That's how to change a LiPo connector. I've demonstrated on the XT60, but the same safety principles I demonstrated, like taping up the connector, making sure you do the wires one at a time, apply to changing over of any LiPo connector. With a little bit of practice, you will be knocking these out like no tomorrow. Anyway, hope you like this video. If you found it useful, by all means, share with friends. Well, thumbs up if you like this video, guys. Post any comments you might have in the comment section below the video, and hit the circle below to subscribe. And if you do hit the circle, don't forget to hit the bell.